Our first presentation is going to be given today by Ms. Amber Ebarb, and she's here to discuss with us the mobilizing tribes to protect the federal Indian budget. Amber serves as Legislative Associate and Program Manager for the Policy Research Center working on NCAI budgets and appropriations efforts, as well as leading our consensus activities. Please join me in welcoming Amber. Amber Ebarb.
Sorry, Amber, the podium's way too far over.
Okay, that's fine. Good morning. My name is Amber Ebarb. I work on budget appropriations issues for the National Congress of American Indians.
Do you want to bring the mic closer to you?
Sure. Good morning. I'm Clinkit from Alaska, from the Raven Dog Salmon Clan, and I work on budget appropriations issues for the National Congress of American Indians. I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me to share what is happening with what is known as the Fiscalcliff. And I'd like to acknowledge President Thomas, who has been a mentor on budget issues for a long time with NCAI and for me. So thank you for giving time on the agenda to go over these really important issues. I'm hoping to explain the potential threats to the federal trust responsibility due to the fiscal cliff and offer ways that tribes can counteract those threats and protect the Indian budget and what is going to be a really controversial time in the next few months. Before I start, it's true that Washington, D.C. lives in superlatives. Everything is the worst. The next election is going to be the most monumental, and upcoming disasters are said to be the most disastrous. But if we actually go over this fiscal cliff, it'll be really, really bad for tribes. So in the most basic terms, the fiscal cliff is a series of policy changes that are going to automatically occur if Congress does nothing. On the spending side, we have sequestration. This is the result of the Budget Control Act and the budget debate from last year to raise the debt ceiling. This is the really horrible part for the trust responsibility, which is going to hit January 2013. And I'll go over some details of how that will happen later in the presentation. On the tax side, all of the Bush tax cuts from 2001, 2003, and extended into 2010 will expire. There are also the Obama-era stimulus tax credits that will be expiring, which will play a huge role in Indian country. And there are other smaller extenders, and the unemployment insurance will expire at the same time. So if Congress does nothing, it could spark another recession. So I want to share how tribes can be proactive in this situation and be prepared both on the spending and tax side of this whole debate so that we can be prepared to talk with lawmakers as they make decisions at the end of the year. So now is the time to be engaged. Some of you already are engaged, and we had the Tribal Unity Week in the middle of September that was really effective in bringing tribal leaders up to the Hill to talk about these issues. Grand bargains are being discussed right now that could affect the size of the pie available for Indian programs, so it's incredibly important that we remain engaged on this issue. Details of some of the proposals that are floating are in your packets. If you registered, there is a document called Protecting the Federal Trust Responsibility in the Federal Budget, which outlines specifically some of the recent proposals that are being debated in Congress and how that would constrain what is available for Indian programs in the budget over the next 10 years. The guiding principles of this debate that we are following is that these programs are the result of treaties, agreements, and executive orders. It's a historic duty to fulfill and should not be sacrificed in any budget deal that comes down. At the heart of the debate is what should be the role and size of government. The authority to fund these obligations are written into the Constitution, and the Indian Commerce Clause, the Treaty Clause, and the Property Clause. And that's a key point to make. Even though, for instance, last week Senator Jeff Sessions included the Indian Health Service in a list of welfare programs, these are clearly federal responsibilities and should be honored in any deal moving forward. Ultimately, our message is we have to replace the sequester. We have to turn off the sequester with a plan that reduces the deficit and does not only rely on spending cuts and actually may pull from other sides of the budget as well. This graph shows the proposed outlays for 2013, and I know most of you know this, but we are such a small slice of the federal budget, and we are competing against so many loud voices right now that we have to be united and carrying the same message to the Hill so that we don't get drowned out in all of these other competing interests. A significant number of Indian programs are in the dark blue area of discretionary spending, and that's funded in the annual appropriations bills each year. About 15% is non-defense discretionary, 18% is defense discretionary, and those are both being affected by the sequester. The light blue is the mandatory spending. And then if you look at where Indian Health Service and BIA is, Indian Health Service is only 1/10% of federal outlays, and BIA is only 0.07%. And so we have to be united to protect these parts of the budget. And we've been successful in the appropriations process to date, but we're going to have to be even more united moving forward in the next few months. Advocates for the military budget are explaining how devastating this would be as defense policy and also impact economic recovery, and we have to explain how devastating it would also be to social programs and Indian programs. So this is the sequester impact for Indian country. The Budget Control Act was a two-stage process. It set in place caps already for spending for the next 10 years for the appropriations bills that are already really difficult to meet. On top of that, they set in place a sequester which was supposed to be so intolerable that Congress would come to an agreement over some sort of grand bargain in 2011, and they failed. So now we're facing the impact of sequestered hit in January. That's why a grand bargain this year is so important to replace the cuts that are coming all out of spending. Nothing is coming out of the revenue side, or a very small amount is coming through entitlements. So what is before Congress right now is how to replace the sequester with something that doesn't only affect discretionary spending. The impact on Indian programs will be really devastating, and we've outlined some of those details in the paper, and I won't go through all of the specific percentage cuts, but Indian Housing Block Grant, for instance, would be cut 20% if you compare it to recent cuts since fiscal year 2010. So sharing how that will impact your tribes at a local level is a key part of this, of our strategy, because we have done the national level analysis, and translating that to local impacts is really important moving forward. There are various approaches right now, and I'm going to cover a few of those. You heard in the debate last night, if you watched it, Obama, who said that the sequester won't happen, and that pretty much caught all of Washington, D.C. off guard, because everybody's fretting so much about what is going to happen to the Department of Defense and all the social programs when 8% comes down out of spending in FY 2013 in January. But he said it won't happen, and so it shows a level of confidence. It shows the back and forth between Republicans and Democrats, the administration and Congress. Nobody is really sure what's going to happen, although nobody wants it to happen. If there is gridlock, it's possible it will happen. And so we have to, I just want to equip us with the facts so that we can participate in the debate where necessary. There is these are the impacts on spending of the various approaches from the last slide. The second lowest line in blue shows the impact of accepting the deal in the Budget Control Act, which accepts the caps already and implements the sequester. So that would be a dramatic drop in January 2013, and this is what we're trying to avoid.
Percentage of gross domestic product.
Yeah, this is spending as a percentage of the economy over the next 10 years. The top line is the baseline, the black line is the baseline, the projected spending, and the lowest line actually is the House Republican leadership's proposal, which takes some of the spending cuts that were slated for Department of Defense and moves them to non-defense. So that's why it's so much steeper than even the sequester. Actually, if if the House Republican leadership's budget goes forward, domestic cuts would be 3 times as deep as under sequestration. And so that's something that we'll have to consider. It would just constrain the overall top line numbers. And even though we have strong appropriations champions, that will be really difficult to operate under if that's what we're dealing with. And President Obama has pledged that he won't, he'll veto any legislation to address the fiscal cliff if it doesn't include any revenue increases, and that's the real sticking point. So next, I'll talk about the revenue side of the fiscal cliff. This is a new area of analysis that NCAI hasn't really addressed recently, but I thought it was important to include in this presentation because it plays such a huge role in this entire controversy. On the tax side of the fiscal cliff, there is cause for concern for Indian people. I'll go briefly over how the expiring tax cuts affect the budget situation and how they affect Indian people. Later this week, you'll hear from our staff attorney, Derek Beetso, who will be presenting specifically on things like tax-exempt bonds and our tax initiative, general welfare doctrine, state streamlined sales tax, and things like that. But I'm going to talk about the larger tax issues as they relate to the budget situation. If we go over the tax side of the fiscal cliff, overall tax liability will jump 20% overall and affect 90% of households. The average federal tax increase will be $3,500. Mid-income would go up to $2,000 due to taxes. And the most disputed provisions are the expiring tax cuts for high-income households and the 2009 stimulus tax credits under the president. Also, the health care reform law. Taxes are disputed, but it's likely those will go into effect. And before I explain more about the tax pieces, this is a graph of this is to remind us the distribution of household income. These income groups roughly match up with the income distribution of the entire population broken into 5 groups, and it's a common way that tax policy analysts examine the impact of tax policies on the population. If you look at American Indians and Alaska Native households, you can see tribal households skew into the lower income distribution of income. And then if you look at American Indians on reservations, they really skew into the lower income groups, the lower, the second lowest in the middle. And so when we look at these various provisions, you can keep in mind which parts will affect Indian country. So really quickly, these are the major components of the fiscal cliff. There's the payroll tax cut. Neither candidate wants to extend the Social Security payroll tax cut, so it's likely it will rise, even though it's very important to Indian country. There's the health care reform laws that will likely go up or be implemented. It's not likely it'll be repealed. Capital gains and dividends tax cuts. The president has called for them to expire, and the Democratic Senate supports it, although Republicans support extending them. So there's disagreement, and that's up in the air. There's the high income deduction limitation. The president wants that to go up, and the Republicans want to extend them. There's the stimulus tax cuts, which include the earned income tax credit, the child care tax credit, and the college student tax credit. The president wants those extended, but the House Republicans don't. There's extenders, which are likely to be avoided, and those include some tribal tax extenders, and Derek will cover some of those. And then the low and middle class Bush tax cuts, what the president and Republicans want to extend, but they could be caught up in the gridlock, and it might lapse, or they might go up. And so those, even though it's agreed upon that it would be bad for those to raise, it just could get caught up in the mix. And then there's the alternative minimum tax, which is just so that high-income people pay at least a minimum amount of tax, but it's affecting more people in the middle-income groups than most people want. So this is the average federal tax rate by income percentile, and you can see the lowest income percentile on the left pays very little income tax due to tax credits like the earned income tax credit, and it's a progressive tax code, and that's what we want right now. And if we go over the fiscal cliff, average tax rates will go up about 4% for the lowest income groups, 7% for the highest income groups, and an average of 5%. The tax increases by cliff component, so they will all affect Indian country very differently depending on where the population falls in these different income groups. The lowest will be impacted significantly by the payroll tax cut, which I've mentioned. And then the Obama stimulus tax credits will those two will make up the largest increases for the lowest income group. The economic effects of the earned income tax credit is well documented in Indian country. It provides economic relief for families and improves economic flow in local communities. So that will be pretty difficult for low-income families in Indian country. The low and middle income Bush tax cuts will affect a large amount of people in the second lowest and middle income groups, and those are the ones that everyone wants to extend. And then these are the most controversial provisions. The high income Bush tax cuts will affect the top fifth of the population and the top 1% and top 0.1%. This is what everybody is debating back and forth about right now, especially at the presidential level. So here's the state of play. Now that I've done a crash course on the tax provisions expiring, you can see that I've mentioned the president has promised to veto any legislation that doesn't include revenue in the resolution to this situation. And it's the major sticking point in the way of compromise. There's a gang of 8 working in the Senate on a core of a proposal, but nobody really knows what's included in that. The situation depends on how much the framework addresses revenues and entitlement spending, and that will affect how much pressure is relieved off of discretionary. If the administration changes, however, Republicans may just work off of the House-passed legislation, which replaces the defense sequester with cuts to social programs and leaves more revenue provisions out of the picture. So whether sequestration happens or not is a matter for Congress to address, and rather than the president at this point. They're mostly talking about messages. It's all in Congress's court right now. So here are the actions that we can take. The message that we're operating on is that if deficit reduction relies all on spending cuts, the damage to Indian programs will be much worse than sequestration. And cutting domestic programs, including tribal services, won't balance the budget. They've already made the most sacrifices so far. The actions that you can take as a tribal leader or advocate is to share the specifics of how the impact will play out in your tribe. We have some data and we need the stories. Your stories are what we need to show the percentage cut of 20% to Indian housing or Indian health service or all of the other programs or losing somebody on unsafe roads. Another action you could take is some tribes have prepared specific reports. One large tribe during our Tribal Unity Week put together a sequester impact report for specific programs. And for instance, the food distribution program would serve 10,000 less people. The Indian Health Service would serve 83,000 less patients and 127 jobs would be lost. JOM would serve 2,300 less students and 300 adults wouldn't be trained. And they did this for every program that they administered. And it was very powerful to carry that kind of information to the Office of Management and Budget and other members on the Budget Committee and Appropriations Committees. If your tribe could compile similar reports, that'd be really helpful. Upcoming dates, we're trying to set up targeted Hill meetings during the lame duck session, similar to what we did during the Unity Week in September. And so if you'll be in town in November, December, and would like to be a part of some targeted meetings, we can help set those up, and we'd be happy to go with you to them or partner or make those, talk to the schedulers. Also in December, there's the NCAI Budget Task Force, and we'll be putting together our annual Indian Country Budget Request, which is we work with all of the national tribal organizations and any tribal leaders that are interested in participating. They can bring in their tribal priorities and issues and incorporate into a national tribal budget request that sets the framework for the rest of our appropriations advocacy throughout the year. It's been very helpful to appropriators when they're talking, or to understand the scope of the federal trust responsibility and all the places that it falls in the federal budget. We release that during the State of Indian Nations in January each year, and so it's a great way to be involved. These are some resources that you can turn to. There's the Tax Policy Center. There's a Non-Defense Discretionary United Coalition. a Save for All campaign with the Coalition on Human Needs. And then you can always call NCAI and stay in touch if you have any questions about anything that we presented or anything about the paper, or if you, anything you want to talk about, you can always call us up to talk more about these issues. So I've taken us all to the edge of the fiscal cliff, and I hope that this has enlightened everyone a little bit about what's being discussed in the debates and then all of the various campaigns when it comes to the budget and tax situation. So I hope it's been helpful. Thank you. Ganesh Chish.